This video will wrap up the living world section of the review, and it's that last part in this section of the review packet on ecosystem diversity, or really just biodiversity in general. So number 22 here asks us to explain how preserving biodiversity is directly related to the availability of natural capital. Well, first, let's actually take a look at natural capital a little bit as I delete all this stuff that was here from last video. So natural capital are all the natural resources that we can get from ecosystems, right? So this refers to, right, drinking water. This refers to lumber from trees. It refers to the activity that pollinators do for us, right? It's almost synonymous with ecosystem services. And the reason why biodiversity is directly related to the availability of natural capital, because it is the all the different living things in the ecosystem that sustain the processes that make these natural resources available. So here I kind of wrote out an answer for you here, right? That natural capital refers to the resources and services that ecosystems provide us. And because organisms and ecosystems are so integrated as part of the food webs, symbioses, and biogeochemical cycles, the biodiversity that sustains the natural resources must be preserved to maintain useful natural capital. So that means if we want to continue using the resources that ecosystems provide us, we must maintain the biodiversity that allows these services to exist and persist. The next part of that is actually kind of related to it, where it asks us to explain how biodiversity increases the survival of a species during the process of natural selection and evolution. And there's actually two ways to interpret this question. It says biodiversity, but doesn't specify what kind of biodiversity, right? Remember that biodiversity can be analyzed at three different levels, right? It can be analyzed at the genetic diversity level, the species diversity level, and the ecosystem diversity level. So when I first read this question, I interpreted it as a genetic diversity question. So genetic diversity, right, increases the variety and range of traits, right? All the different phenotypes that a species can exhibit. A greater range in genetic traits would allow a species to possibly have a trait or a version of a trait that better helps it survive as environments naturally change, or as the environment changes as a result of human activity. But then I remembered that the subheading here is on ecosystem diversity. So now the question is, how does ecosystem diversity increase the survival of a species? Well, as environments change, as ecosystems change, what you're really changing is the range of a species, right? If succession continues and a grassland slowly becomes a forest, or the range of a forest changes because of changing global temperatures, what you are doing is you are changing the range of an ecosystem. So the greater variety of ecosystems there are, the greater probability there is that a species can survive by migrating to different areas where perhaps there is a niche that it can fulfill in a slightly different area. So there's a couple of different ways to interpret this question, but I think the genetic diversity is probably the best interpretation of what this question is asking for. The next one asks about island biogeography. So here it says that two islands at different distances from the mainland have different rates of extinction, and that is explained by the theory of island biogeography, which is essentially this graph. So the whole idea is that if you are an island that is larger, you're more likely to have a greater number of species on it. And if you are an island that is closer to the mainland, you are also more likely to have a greater number of species on it. But all of that falls on some sort of distribution, right? There's a spectrum of island sizes and distances. So here, what we're saying here is that the closer you are to an island, the greater your rate of immigration, which means the greater number of species you're going to have emigrating to that island. If you are an island that is far away from the mainland, right, you're going to have a smaller amount of organisms immigrating from the mainland into that island. Same thing here as far as rates of extinction. Small islands will have very high rates of extinction because they don't have quite as many resources, right? They don't have as many niches to exploit. And then you have large islands, which will have slightly smaller rates of extinction. And then there are these points here that are labeled A, B, C, D. Those are what we call equilibrium points. And those are areas where the island has enough immigration to balance out the amount of species that are going extinct over a period of time in an island. Now, keep in mind, these are over long periods of time. So these are long periods of time. It's not like a species will go extinct every single week. So if there's an island that is far away from the mainland, its equilibrium point is a little bit sooner. There will be fewer species on that island because fewer are immigrating into it and more are going extinct. That's essentially what this graph is trying to tell you. It's giving you a model, a prediction over the number of species that can survive on an island given its size and distance from the mainland. So let's look at all the different components of an ecosystem that provide us a valuable ecosystem service. So a honeybee, it's a pollinator, right? Honeybees pollinate flowers, they allow them to bloom, they allow them to fruit, and it is estimated actually that bees do the equivalent work of $15 billion of pollination. So what that means is if all the bees went extinct and all the pollinators went away, it would cost us $15 billion to do it ourselves. The water cycle is an abiotic component of an ecosystem, and there's actually a couple of things that it does, right? Precipitation reduces the need to irrigate crops, right? If it's raining, you don't need to water your crops. And percolation refills groundwater, and we use groundwater to drink. So these are both valuable services that are provided to us by the water cycle. Forests provide us with lumber, but forests also do a lot of other things. We could do it for more than just provisioning, right? Forests absorb rain, which prevents flooding in a watershed, right? So that's a regulating service that a forest can provide. Bats can be used as biological pest management. So bats can eat a lot of the pests that we are trying to remove from our crops. So we can use it in conjunction with other methods of pest management, right? Integrated pest management to reduce our pesticide use. And they are also pollinators that I spelled wrong. Of course I did. Bacteria, right? The majority of the nitrogen cycle in some way is mediated by bacteria. So bacteria do nitrogen fixation for soil fertility. A coral reef provides a very valuable service to coastal environments. They absorb the energy of waves, which mediates the effects of coastal storms and also tourism. I mean, they're very pretty if you ever get the chance to see a coral reef. And then wetlands, right? The most important thing about wetlands is they absorb floodwater, but they also remediate out pollutants in a watershed. So let's say there is some water pollution in a watershed that's flowing down through the river and the runoff. Wetlands can act to remediate that. It can filter some of those pollutants out before that water eventually makes its way into a delta or the ocean, which is usually the endpoint for a watershed. And finally, this is something that we've been practicing for quite a while now. It asks us to strengthen this weak statement. Protecting endangered species like the giant panda costs too much and should be stopped. This question is not asking you to invalidate that point. This question is asking you to strengthen that statement. It's asking you to give a better reason why we should stop protecting the giant panda. So, historically speaking, our ability to preserve the panda has been really, really bad. We are not successful at all at protecting the panda. It has been very expensive. And although there has been a slight increase in their wild population, the best efforts of scientists have largely failed, and that is true. Their bodies are not well supported by their specialist diet of eucalyptus, which for some reason they continue to eat despite having no nutritional value and being somewhat toxic. And they have really low birth rates. Female pandas, their mating ritual is super long, so that can take weeks, if not months. And worse yet, if a female panda does give birth, they really only give birth to like one cub at a time. So their reproductive rates are really low. So efforts are better spent on species more likely to make a better recovery, or on a species that have a keystone role in their ecosystem. Pandas are not a keystone species. Every species in an ecosystem is important, right? But pandas are not a keystone species, so it's not like other species rely on them. So perhaps our efforts and our money are better spent perhaps protecting species that are endangered that do serve a very important role in an ecosystem. So that more or less wraps up the living world review. We're going to start on the next section next week. And we're also going to go ahead and take a look at writing experimental design answers. So next week, be prepared to have your best scientific experimenter hat on, because we're going to be doing a lot of work with how do you design an experiment, how do you evaluate how good an experiment was, and that's what we're going to go ahead and start working on next week.